For the past 2 years, Capcom has been doing surveys on what games they should do next, and it definitely seems Capcom is already gearing up with Dead Rising 2 Remake. Now, there's actually a ton of evidence to support this idea, so let's get started and break it down. Now, for starters, as mentioned before, Capcom has been doing this kind of survey every 2 years, so I think it's very sus that Capcom recently did another survey basically all about Dead Rising. So for starters, the first thing that I actually want to mention is, as stated at the beginning of the video, Capcom has been doing these surveys since the past 2 years. They keep bringing them up. They don't really advertise them all that much, but there was one very sus survey that released specifically for Dead Rising. The question that they basically asked that was very important was, would you like to see more Deluxe Remaster titles like this in the future? Deluxe Remasters defined as remasters with improved playability and updated graphics. Now, what was interesting here is that you could actually write down and state yes. Second is, I'd prefer a remake over a deluxe remaster, a simple remaster with improved resolution, or no, I wouldn't. Another question that was actually very important here is that it basically asked, do you want more Dead Rising releases in the future? If so, please select the single game you'd most like to see release. So here you can actually pick Dead Rising 2, Dead Rising 2 off the record, Dead Rising 3, or DR4. Essentially, they're kind of asking fans what they want. Or you can also pick, I want a remake of one of the games in Dead Rising, I want a complete brand new Dead Rising game. So yeah, very interesting stuff that Capcom is essentially just asking their viewers, their fans, what they want. Now, as mentioned, this is nothing new. They've been doing it for 2 years, but I find the timing very strange. And by the way, if you guys haven't already, make sure to actually take the survey. I'll leave a link down in the description. It's only valid until October 18th. Now, another thing that kind of supports this idea that Capcom is in fact working on Dead Rising 2, or they're getting very close to doing it, is actually because they did a bunch of the devs for Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster did end up talking with Inverse, and the interview said a lot. So let's actually go over the most important part of the interview, and that being, Dead Rising is obviously the game in the series most like the first Dead Rising. Regardless of whether there are any plans, do you think it'd be possible to remake Dead Rising 2 the same way, or would that be more difficult? So great question by Inverse, and Morimoto, Kei Morimoto specifically, who is the producer of Deluxe Remaster for Dead Rising, essentially said remaking or remastering Dead Rising 2 is definitely possible for the time being. We're monitoring market trends and how Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster performs. If we're able to identify an appropriate time where we'd be able to sell a remake or remaster of Dead Rising 2, there's potential for the project to be considered. So there's a lot of details to break down in this small statement. Obviously, it's very logical for the producer of Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster to essentially say that if Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster, or DRDR for short, actually ends up selling a lot, then it's a no-brainer for Capcom to end up doing a remake or a remaster for Dead Rising. Now, another thing that I should also note that I find very interesting is that Morimoto essentially said that he didn't know if they were actually going to do a Dead Rising 2 remake or a remaster. Now, the interesting part here is that obviously it is worth noting that Capcom likes to use different terms for their remakes or remasters. Like, for example, Deluxe Remaster isn't a term that's used in gaming. Another thing too, if we're talking about Resident Evil, which is another Capcom IP, they've used reimaginings for a lot of their terminology, even though everyone in the community has referred to Resident Evil, the new Resident Evil games, as remakes, right? Like, especially if we're talking about Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, and Resident Evil 4. So it's very interesting that he uses the term remake and remaster. Obviously, it's, one could imply that Kei Morimoto is obviously referring to a deluxe remaster, and since this is Capcom that we're talking about, when he says remake, one could also take the word remake as meaning reimagining, especially if we're discussing Capcom here. So now, another interesting part here that is definitely worth mentioning is that it's very sus that the producer Kei Morimoto had such a well thought out answer to the interviewer's question. It definitely seems like Capcom, or aka the Dead Rising team, has definitely had talks about if they were to remake or remaster Dead Rising 2, which path should they take? Should they just do it, one-to-one, exactly what they did with Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster, much in the same way as Dead Space, a remake, or if they should do a remake style that's very similar to the Resident Evil remakes, aka what Capcom loves to mention as well is that they're reimagining. So personally, that kind of begs the question, what do I think about all this? If Capcom were to make a Dead Rising 2, should it be a remake? Should it be a deluxe remaster? I definitely think for Dead Rising 2, if we're talking about that game, it definitely needs to be a reimagining, aka a Capcom remake of the game. And the reason I say that is because there's obviously, Dead Rising 2 specifically had a very strange strange kind of release. Obviously, we had the base game that had Dead Rising 2, but then we also had like a what if scenario of Dead Rising 2 off the record. Not to mention Xbox 360 specifically got 2 DLCs. One of them was very interesting because it was kind of like after the events of Dead Rising 2, where you essentially go with Frank and go off to Phenotrans or whatever. It's worth noting I haven't played this DLC because I never had an Xbox, so it's something that I'm very curious about. But I guess the point here that I'm trying to make is that if you were to make Dead Rising 2 and then have Frank show up later, like in a DLC, or not DLC, but I guess just part of the game, I think it would be better if maybe Frank and Chuck were both in the same location at the same time. And since Dead Rising 2 is a cooperative game, I think having both characters there at the same time would be kind of nice, right? But I don't know, this is just an idea that I'm throwing out there. Regardless, I definitely think that having, bits and pieces from Dead Rising off the record or Dead Rising 2 kind of combined into one would be a very cool experience, rather than having just the standard Dead Rising 2 and having Rebecca Chang die. Because as many of you guys know, if you guys have been watching my Dead Rising videos, you guys know that I don't think having Rebecca Chang die made a lot of sense. But the important detail here to remember, as Kei Morimoto stated in the interview, if DRDR sells really well, then it's a no-brainer for Capcom to essentially keep pumping out remakes. And as he mentioned, it could be a remake, could be a remaster. Let me know what you guys think. And by the way, if you guys want more Dead Rising content, click this video right here where I go over the review of Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster. Anyways, thank you so much for watching.